Okay, and it looks like we have everybody signed in and ready to go, and a great audience here. Some people have found the question panel. Thank you for sending in your questions and a check-in on the sound. So we'll get started. Let me introduce Priscilla de la Cruz, who is our Rhode Island director. She's been working for years to bring aggregation to Rhode Island, and she'll present the first part, and then we'll go through some questions. Priscilla?
Great, thank you very much, Daria. So as Daria mentioned, I'm Priscilla de la Cruz, the Rhode Island Director for Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I have been with the organization for about 10 years, and the past few years focusing a lot of my time in advancing green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island. I also want to acknowledge Daria Mark, who's been doing great work in Massachusetts as our community outreach manager, to continue advancing this model that we've developed, green municipal aggregation. And also on the call is Jaima Braga, or our Renewable Energy Procurement Director. So thank you, Jaima Braga, for joining us as well. I want to start off by thanking you all for taking the time to join us during these times. I hope that you're all well and healthy. I'm excited today to dive into green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island, which is also known as Community Choice Aggregation. So first, to start with who we are and what we do as Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We are a local nonprofit organization, and we harness our power as energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. And we have been doing this since 1982. As a pro-consumer and pro-environment organization, we focus on delivering programs that enable consumers to make green energy choices. And most recently, in the past few years, we're also working with communities and enabling them to access green energy choices as well. And that is the focus of our presentation today, talking about what we've been doing at the community level to advance green municipal aggregation. And primarily our work does take place in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island, but the work that we do also has an advocacy component. So really our programs are designed to reinforce what we do at the advocacy level. And some of the advocacy work also has impacts at the regional level. So getting into our agenda, what are we going to cover today? We're going to dive into what is electricity aggregation? What are the steps to achieve green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island, and again, also known as Community Choice Aggregation? And what is the status of green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island? And then Daria will walk us through some of the Massachusetts case studies that we want to share with you, and also start talking to us about greenwashing and how green municipal aggregation is a very strong tool that can help us overcome some of that greenwashing. And then we'll get into, lastly, how can you contribute to growing green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island? And just a reminder here, as Daria mentioned, you can type in your questions into the questions section, and we will address those throughout the presentation and also towards the end of the webinar. So getting started, municipal aggregation, the process by which a municipality can purchase electricity in bulk from a competitive supplier, and that is on behalf of its residents and small businesses. So that is really defining that concept of community choice aggregation. And again, why do we do this in bulk? Because by doing it in bulk and bringing together that stronger demand of a buyer's group, that can lead to cheaper, more stable electricity costs on the supply side. And why at the municipality level? Well, a municipality can purchase electricity on behalf of its residents and small businesses, really giving that community more control over its electricity. And we are seeing that there are states, as you see very small here on the right-hand side on this map in green, there are states within the U.S. that are taking advantage of this option and using it as a vehicle to not only get cheaper electricity supply, but also green electricity supply. And I want to take a moment on this slide to just acknowledge the difference between what we're talking about today, which is our concept, our program, green municipal aggregation, also known as Community Choice Aggregation, and that distinction with what the League of Cities and Towns does in Rhode Island. So for over a decade, the League of Cities and Towns has been providing municipal aggregation that is for municipality electricity load for a lot of the cities and towns within the state. And they've been doing this, like I mentioned, for over 10 years. The difference is with what we're doing now is that this is now the municipality offering those same benefits and aggregating on behalf of its residents and small businesses. So we worked a few years ago, back in 2017, to successfully make changes to the municipal aggregation law and now making it easier for communities to take advantage of this option. And we worked with Representative Deborah Bergero from Jamestown to make those changes. So since then, we've been focusing our time in doing outreach and letting communities know that they now have this option. So getting into green municipal aggregation, our favorite flavor of community choice aggregation. This is a program that we developed a few years ago and launched in Massachusetts. So municipal aggregation, green municipal aggregation, or GMA, what it does, it takes that concept of aggregating and purchasing in bulk the electricity on behalf of its residents and small businesses at the municipal level, and then adding green electricity. And that's huge for us also as an organization and also for the environmental impact of that. For over 15 years, our organization has been doing this at the individual level, and we might have some of our green-powered members on the call that have been purchasing green electricity and supporting local renewable energy at the individual level. And now we're talking about being able to do that at scale at a community level. So when you take that concept of municipal aggregation and then add green electricity, what you're doing is dramatically increasing the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And we know we need to be very aggressive in making those reductions. And we're doing that through this multi-year support for renewable energy electricity. So going through a program where you can procure green electricity sources over a few years and then being able to pass that through the utility, which in our case is National Grid, that would not change. We're just changing the supply component here and then bringing that into our communities and our homes. And what we're seeing in Massachusetts is that typically communities are starting, let's say, at 5%. And this is really a percentage that's chosen by the community. How much renewable energy do they want to add to their aggregation program? And when we're talking about additional renewable energy, we're talking about in addition to our renewable energy standard. That is a standard that requires our utility, National Grid, or a utility in Rhode Island to exceed the percentage that is required in a given year to come from renewable energy sources. So for example, in Rhode Island, our renewable energy standard right now is at about 16% in 2020. So when we're talking about, let's say, an additional 5%, that is above that renewable energy standard. And the neat thing that happens here, because we're talking about a multi-year process and contract, is that our community can choose to make regular increases every few years to that percentage. It could be 10%. For example, in Brookline, Massachusetts, and Daria will get more into this, we're now seeing that community adding 25 to 30% above that renewable portfolio standard, which is what the law is called in Massachusetts. So getting into what does a typical green municipal aggregation program look like? So we're going to start here to the right, looking at this green bubble, where by default, let's go with 5%. Again, that is up to the community if they want to do 5, 10%, and so on of additional green electricity added on to their aggregation program. So that community, once they've chosen that percentage, then as an individual consumer, I can choose to go ahead and up, down, or up. So if I decide for whatever reason I don't want to have that additional 5%, I can up, down. Or I can say I want to actually do 100% renewable energy and still take advantage of the cost savings while adding that 100% option coming from renewable energy sources. And what's neat here is that the program is just really designed to give the consumer more options. We're now giving this option of a green municipal aggregation program with that additional renewable energy. But if for whatever reason a consumer wants to go ahead and opt out of that default option within that program, they can go to a competitive supplier, or they can choose, looking here at the orange circle, to just stay with that basic service offered by the utility, in our case, National Grid. Any consumers that are with competitive suppliers, as you see in the red bubble, they would opt into the program. Now, looking at, what goes into a green municipal aggregation program. So here we're going to start from our left and work towards our right. So again, this is community driven. It's decided at the community level to initiate this process of exploring green municipal aggregation, or a version of community choice aggregation. And then once that community has that goal, intent to pursue aggregation, they're going to choose a consultant to work with. And you see here at the bottom, the consultant that we work with and designed our program with is called Good Energy. So that consultant is responsible for helping you create a program, and they are not only responsible, but they're excited to do that with you to ensure that they can walk you through that process and all of the requirements that go into that process in creating a plan, making sure you're following the law. And I'll walk you through what those steps are, but this is the essential role of a consultant, making sure that you're following those steps and really taking the onus from the municipality of having to figure that out on their own. And then that consultant, Good Energy, will help you choose a competitive supplier, and we will work with that consultant, Good Energy, for example, and the chosen competitive supplier to add that additional renewable energy. And we're doing that in the form of renewable energy certificates via a contract. And in our next slide, I will walk you through what a renewable energy certificate is. But then working our way again towards the right, we're seeing that then we're all working together to ensure that you're getting that physical electricity, and that the renewable energy certificates that are being added to that contract are above what that renewable energy standard requires. So there are all these moving components and parts, but we're all working together as a community, as a consultant, Good Energy, and what we do best as a nonprofit, Green Energy Consumers Alliance, in providing those local renewable energy sources and delivering that through a contract to a community. So now getting into renewable energy certificates. And I want to pause here to say that we have a wealth of information on our website and in our blogs that really walk you through the renewable energy market and renewable energy certificates. But when we're talking about renewable energy certificates as defined by our renewable energy standard, we're talking about new renewable energy sources, and often also referred to in Rhode Island as Class 1, as well in Massachusetts. So really, these renewable energy certificates are designed to encourage the development of renewable energy. And one renewable energy certificate equals 1 megawatt hour. And that 1 megawatt hour equals 1,000 megawatt hours of renewable energy. So for example, when you have a wind turbine that's spinning, that wind turbine is going to spin and produce that one renewable energy certificate, and in turn, the equivalent of 1 megawatt hour. And why the term new? We emphasize that because that's really what's going to create a concept that Daria will get into later on called additionality. We need these new renewable energy certificates to be able to accelerate the development of renewable energy and create greater demand and pressure on the renewable energy market. So as defined by our renewable energy standard, we're talking about projects that are built after 1997. And we're talking, there's a list of sources, but some of the most common ones are wind, solar, hydro, and digester gas. And the average home will use about 7 renewable energy certificates per year. And to just go back to that concept of 1 renewable energy certificate equaling 1 megawatt hour, we're separating the physical electricity electrons from that renewable energy certificate that's generated. And those certificates can be sold separately from electrons or that monetary value. So next on our agenda, we are going to get into the steps to achieve municipal aggregation in Rhode Island, but we'll pause here. So go ahead and write in your questions. If there's anything you want us to clarify throughout the presentation or towards the end of the webinar about electricity and electricity aggregation, we could probably spend a couple hours just working through the electricity market itself, but we try to just be concise for the sake of this webinar. So getting into steps to achieve for municipal aggregation. In Rhode Island, these steps are in accordance to the Municipal Aggregation statute and law. So first, a community, a city or town, for example, let's say Providence, would have to pass a resolution directing the town or the city to create a plan that would be reviewed by the council. Next, we get into what I mentioned earlier, working with a consultant to create an aggregation plan. And, you know, that is the second step because really the consultant, for example, Good Energy wants to make sure that we're following the steps in accordance to what the law requires and that there is that intent coming from the city to pursue an aggregation plan. And then third, which is a really critical component of the law in Rhode Island, is hosting a public meeting. It's essential that the community has the opportunity to weigh in on that plan and provide feedback. And then the plan is revised as needed, and then it is prepared for final approval by the city. And the fourth step is getting it in front of the Public Utilities Commission, who will review that plan to ensure that it's consistent with the state law. And that's why I mentioned earlier that that is the critical role that that consultant plays, and not only being able to go ahead and secure a contract with that competitive supplier and add that local procurement of renewable energy, but also ensure that you are meeting the steps that are required by the municipal aggregation law. So continuing the steps here to achieve green municipal aggregation, that consultant will put out to bid and secure a competitive supplier for your aggregation program. The mayor or town manager selects among the bids to create a contract, and that's what we mentioned earlier. We're seeing most communities in Massachusetts do a 2 to 3 year contract. And then finally, update the Public Utilities Commission for final approval. So again, go ahead and type in your questions in the questions section. Next, we're going to dive into the status of green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island. We will be brief in this section, but we do want to just give you an overview of where we're at. So I had mentioned earlier that you'll hear throughout this webinar, we're not where Massachusetts is in terms of its adoption of green municipal aggregation, but that is because we had to work to go ahead and make changes to the law in Rhode Island in order to make it easier for communities to take advantage of this option at the community level. So since then, we've been doing outreach. So where we are, what's our progress to date? So I'm excited to report that there are 4 communities that have passed resolutions. And those 4 communities are Central Falls, Providence, South Kingstown, and Barrington. So in our map, you see them in the dark green. shade, and these communities right now are really at moving into step 2 to 3. They're working to develop their plans, and of course, considering the current pandemic crisis, just being mindful of how that timeline might change. But overall, these communities are still moving forward, and they're looking at being able to finalize their plans within the next few months, and really getting their plans prepared for a public hearing. The goal is to get these plans to the Public Utilities Commission over the summer. So just wanted to give you an overview, a breakdown by city or town. So in the first column, we see those 4 communities that I reference here, and just want to acknowledge Providence here, setting the tone for this momentum that we're seeing with these 4 communities now. They chose to add community choice aggregation as a goal within their climate justice plan, which is fantastic. Then working our way towards the right, we're seeing communities that are considering a green community choice aggregation. So of course, we're working with them and educating them on this model that we have experience with called green municipal aggregation. And some of those communities include Pawtucket, Newport, Portsmouth, and East Greenwich. Then we're continuing working our way towards the third column. We've had great conversations with communities that are considering community choice aggregation, not certain when they'll move. Some of them want to go ahead and see how the communities that implement their plans first do. But one of the things that we're encouraging these communities to consider is that if we can create a very strong buying group to start, we're going to get better savings overall. So really want to encourage more communities to join, that is these pioneers, Providence, South Kingstown, Central Falls, and Barrington, and getting community choice aggregation going in Rhode Island. And then we see in the last column other communities that are not yet considering community choice aggregation or our version, green municipal aggregation, but we're really hoping that changes. So I am going to pause here again, give you some time to go ahead and type in questions. And now Daria is going to walk us through the next few slides.
Great. Thank you so much. We've had some great questions. So we'll take, Priscilla will take a look at them, and then we'll, as I mentioned, return to them either at the end, or we'll type some answers back to you. So let's talk a little bit about Massachusetts and where Massachusetts is and what we've seen. So this is a map of aggregation. We've been doing aggregation since '97 in Massachusetts, and first town started with brown aggregation, as you see here, where they're just doing aggregation for price savings and stability. And then in the last 3-4 years, we've really seen a lot of green come on the map. It's been really fast changing. More and more communities are choosing 5%, 10%. Brookline started at 25%. Other communities have gone 35, 45, 46% was in Newton. So there's really, you can see there's substantial uptake on this model of doing aggregation and adding green renewable resources to it. And the blue shading here represents those communities that are in progress. So you can see that those green numbers are even going to go faster, and there's going to be even more of them as soon as we get past this crisis and our GPU starts processing the aggregations again. We have a lot of thoughts about green municipal aggregation, and we've been doing it for long enough. I've seen some results that we put together an updated version of our report that we just published in February 2020, all about the what we've seen in green municipal aggregation in Massachusetts. So if you're interested in this further and you want to dig deeper, there's charts, there's explanations of different mechanisms. So I highly encourage you to go to greenenergyconsumers.org and /aggregation and download and read the report. There's also an executive summary that's 4 pages that if you don't have time to invest into the full report, but I highly recommend it if you're interested in the aggregation. So here's another view of a short view of what we've seen. As Priscilla has mentioned, when we're doing aggregation, we're providing most often, although we cannot guarantee in the future because no one can predict the future, but what we've seen in the past is that we're providing consumer savings. So these are ratepayers in the 5 towns. So this is from the beginning of the programs in those 5 different cities or towns in Massachusetts till the end of 2019. Whether or not their program ended in 2019 or not, this is the savings that we've been able to see. So one thing I really want to emphasize is that even in Brookline, which started at 25%, for the duration of the program, they saved ratepayers almost $3 million. That is a substantial amount. So we're able to add 25% to Brookline's aggregation, 25% above the state requirements, and still save money for the consumer. So this is a really, really powerful tool, and it was really powerful tool both to change how we generate electricity and for some consumer protections and savings. And we talk about more savings in the report, of course. So also another way to look at the savings, the orange line, is the utility rates. So these are the rates that we see. They change every 6 months in Massachusetts as the utilities have to go out and procure their electricity. Aggregation rates stay stable and steady through the aggregation contract. So this is a view of Brookline, again, that 25%. So you could see the first line on the bottom is the first contract, and then January 2020 of this, the beginning of this year, Brookline started their second round of aggregation with Good Energy as their broker, and Green Energy Consumers Alliance providing those additional RECs to them. And they went to 30% of renewable content, of additional renewable content, renewable energy certificate content. And then just for comparison, we also added the line of 100%. So Priscilla mentioned that in aggregation programs, you have the choice to opt up. So you can also see that even sometimes the opt-up rate is still lower than what the utilities are able to provide. There's benefits to aggregation beyond the electricity transformation. So how we change our grid also affects how we change the emissions from the things that depend on the grid. So for example, as we go from fossil fuel driven vehicles and gasoline into electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids, that electricity, the cleaner it gets, the cleaner, the fewer emissions are from that vehicle being on the road. So you could see that, for example, in Brookline's case, that's the green line. If you buy a vehicle and you're charging it on Brookline's plus 30% aggregation, by time you're at 2035, you've dropped your emissions to almost zero. And then 10% additional is the blue line, and so that does a little bit better than the Massachusetts basic service, which still does not get us to, till well past 2050 to the zero emissions. So this is really important. And Rhode Island basic service, so this is what renewable energy standard, so a car driven on that for the next till 2050, you can see that line plateaus at 2035 because that's where the renewable energy standard plateaus and it does not add any more renewables. But this is where aggregation can really come in and change that trajectory. The other thing that we use a lot of fossil fuels for is heating our homes. And the electric solution for that is heat pumps. Heat pumps are really versatile. They provide a very efficient, very, very, very efficient heat. And they also provide cooling depending on the season you're in. So if you're considering adding air conditioning, consider doing it instead with heat pumps, because that could take some of the load off of your fossil fuels for heating. And they could be ducted or ductless, and they've been used in Europe and Asia for a long time, and now are increasing in adoption in New England and in the United States. So beware of greenwashing in electricity. I went too fast to the next slide. I see a lot of great questions coming, so please keep them coming, and we will address them as we go along, or we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much for taking your time to do that. All right, so let's talk about the greenwashing in electricity purchases. So this is a list of our sources. This is a map of our sources. And we buy renewable energy certificates from sources that are in New England. This, we even more heavily focus on Massachusetts and Rhode Island as much as we can, and as much as we can support the projects there. You can see the Rhode Island projects right there in the center of the map. We also support a little bit of solar, but you can see there's wind, hydro, digester gas, and it's really essential to buy projects from New England. And the reason for that is it creates additionality. When we buy renewable energy certificates from projects that are in New England, it leaves less renewable energy or RECs on the market to comply with the renewable energy standard in Rhode Island, renewable portfolio standard in Massachusetts, and other requirements. And the fewer RECs are out there in the market, the more RECs that we can suck up into programs such as Green Municipal Aggregation, the more there is a direct push to develop more renewable sources in New England. If you are looking at sources that are national, those projects should absolutely be built, but our money does not need to help those projects be built. Whereas our interest and our funds and our commitments are necessary to get the projects that are built in New England, to get those turbines, to get that solar, to get those digester gas and those hydro plants going. And that's how we change how we generate electricity in New England. Without this push for additionality, then the additional RECs don't do anything. We need them to change how we source our electricity. And now I will give it back to Priscilla to talk about competitive suppliers and how they impact this and how they relate to this conversation that we're having here about renewable electricity.
Thank you, Daria. So I wanted to go ahead and show you this report or this data that came out of this report released by the Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey. And what this report found is that competitive suppliers, due to their misleading tactics, some of us might have had, for example, even in Rhode Island, competitive suppliers knock on our door or sort of disguise themselves in some sort of marketing appeal as our utility, National Grid, and saying that they have a cheaper rate for us. And usually, often what we're seeing and what this report in Massachusetts found is that people who are most vulnerable, elderly folks, communities of color, low income, are disproportionately paying significantly more when going with a competitive supplier. And we're talking millions of dollars more. And it's because they're offering rates, part of it is because they're offering rates that are misleading, usually saying that they're going to beat basic service, either what National Grid or Eversource in Massachusetts is offering for a 6-month period. But what you end up getting is just a fixed rate for about a month, and then it goes into a variable rate. And as Daria talked about, there is greenwashing that happens, where you're being offered some sort of bundle package and saying, we're going to give you cheaper, greener electricity, but then you end up supporting projects that don't do anything for our power grid here in New England, and those projects could be elsewhere, like in Texas and so on. So, you know, of course it's cheaper. It's not having any impact for us here, and it's going, your dollars are going elsewhere. And when we're looking at competitive suppliers, you know, promising to offer something cheaper than competitive supplier, than what your basic service does offer you for a 6-month period, what's tricky is that they're trying to sign you up, you know, as an individual versus doing it at the community scale. So this report highlighted that community choice aggregation is a transparent way of being able to compete with basic service and is a way that's recommended. So that was very encouraging to us, and that's why community choice aggregation, specifically our program, Green Municipal Aggregation, is an essential way of us being able to offer affordable and including green electricity in community choice aggregation programs, and being able to protect consumers by bringing in that municipal vetting process. And although this is talking about a report in Massachusetts, the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers here in Rhode Island released similar data, really highlighting that consumers here in Rhode Island, especially those most vulnerable, again, are overpaying millions of dollars and have been doing that over the past few years. Thank you, Daria. You can go to the next slide. So now getting into how you can help us grow green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island. So we have a very simple call to action for you all. I'm enjoying the great questions that are coming in, and we're going to dive into more of these questions now towards the end of our webinar. But before we do that, I want to say that, you know, a lot of the work that Daria has been doing and that she talked about, we're being able to advance those conversations at the community level because community members and folks like you on the call are voicing their support for green municipal aggregation and asking municipal staff, their mayor or town manager or city council or town council to consider green municipal aggregation. And one of the questions that I saw earlier is, you know, what's been the impact of advocacy? And the impact of advocacy has been huge over the past years, right? That's why we were able to make changes to the municipal aggregation law, making it less onerous for cities and towns to pursue aggregation. But as a nonprofit and in working with our partner with Good Energy, you know, we're doing what we can to do outreach and education and letting communities know that we're here to be a resource and help them work through the process. But when, you know, municipal staff, and as some of you might know through the civic engagement process, that it's critical when city councilors, for example, you know, start hearing about the concept and that there's support. So if you are in a particular city or town, and it's not part of the four that are moving forward, Providence, Barrington, South Kingstown, and Central Falls, and you want to work with us to advance community choice aggregation, let us know. You can reach out to me directly, and at the end, you'll see our contact information, and we can work with you and give you the tools and the talking points you need to help us advance aggregation. So we're going to get into some of the questions here. Let me go ahead and pull them up. I tried to address some of them directly, but there's some that I think are great for us to dive into as a group. And some of them I will ask you, Daria, to speak to because they relate specifically to the work we've been doing in Massachusetts. This one I already started to address. What level of impact has community advocacy had on pushing recent development across Rhode Island versus the independent initiative of a city or town in government? So this is an excellent question because we know that city or towns have limited capacity. And for example, now, you know, in dealing with a crisis and working through a pandemic. So, you know, when being able to bring together a very strong buyers group, it's easier for any small city or town to move forward if they see that they're part of a larger effort. For example, that's what happened with South Kingstown and Central Falls. And within those communities, not only were we doing our advocacy and outreach, but they were active community members within that those communities that said, you know, we want this. We've been following what you've been saying about the benefits of green municipal aggregation in Rhode Island. How can we encourage, you know, our city or town to move forward? So this was this consistent, coordinated effort between myself and others working in that community to advance community choice aggregation. And same thing with Providence, right? They created their climate justice plan, and at the community level, there was feedback, there was engagement in creating their plan, and the community voiced that they want to explore community choice aggregation, and they want to do it with local renewable energy. So another excellent question related to advocacy and things on the legislative side. So the question is, Lieutenant Governor starts with a statement. Lieutenant Governor McKee was pushing this a few years ago, but focused solely on going after lower rates. Have you been in touch with his office at all to get him on board with a focus on clean energy? That's a great question, Andrew. Thank you for that question. So yes, myself, our team, Green Energy Consumers, and also Good Energy that has been doing also advocacy and education here in Rhode Island. Yes, we have been in touch with McKee's office. I've had great conversations around the benefits of community choice aggregation. So although, you know, McKee's office is not publicly stating, you know, this is something great to pursue, we've had good, encouraging conversations. So definitely not in opposition. And I think that's good, right? We don't want opposition, and there is that understanding that aggregating and doing this at the community level is beneficial to communities and can help alleviate those concerns about consumers signing up directly on their own with competitive suppliers. So we're going to continue keeping that door open and continuing the conversation with Lieutenant Governor McKee. So the next question here from Sean: who does Good Energy typically work with in a community, municipality to make that plan? So that's an excellent question. We were talking about the process of developing a plan, and for any city or town, it's going to look different. In some cases, the responsibility is put on the town manager, for example, to coordinate that effort. In other cases, we've seen that a council president will introduce the resolution. So it just really depends. And then for Central Falls, for example, Mayor Diosa and his planning department had been hearing and looking into, I've been hearing about aggregation and looking into it. So the planning department, along with Mayor Diosa, are, you know, overseeing that process and working with Good Energy. So another question related to the consultant. Are there other consultants other than Good Energy to work with? It seems like competition is good for the process. So this question is from Stephen, and it's a great question. Yes, in a market of electricity that's deregulated, competition is great. In terms of offering our flavor, Green Municipal Aggregation, we chose to work with Good Energy a few years ago. We see them as an expert in leading aggregations across the U.S. So they are our chosen partner, and they actually approached us a few years ago because they saw us as a leading nonprofit and as an expert in doing what we do with renewable energy certificates and supporting local renewable energy projects all over Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and New England as well. So we decided to come together. So of course it is up to a given community to decide which consultant they want to work with. I should point out that Central Falls, South Kingstown, Barrington, and Providence have chosen to work with Good Energy. And I think it's pretty significant that the city of Providence, they went through their competitive process. They actually put out a bid requesting proposals to choose their consultant, which is not a requirement. But of course, the city chose to do that, and they chose Good Energy. And we think that's great. And Central Falls also decided to join that joint RFP with Providence and also with South Kingstown. So our next question, how are the consultants funded? Is that a cost the city needs to cover, or is that covered by GMA in Rhode Island somehow? That's a fantastic question. So the consultant will not come in and charge to help you create that program and to help you get that program through, you know, the process of doing the public hearing, having it approved by the town or city, and then going through that final review step through the Public Utilities Commission. But they will charge once the aggregation is implemented, and it's based on the kilowatt hours. It could be something like a cent per kilowatt hour. And that is something that is directly, you know, in the contract that that community decides to sign on to with that consultant. So there's no upfront cost for a city or town to pursue aggregation, which is great. So what are the issues with the law that are discouraging participation? So Steph, thank you very much for that question. I think that's good clarification, a good clarification question. So I mentioned earlier that in 2017, we worked to change the law, the Municipal Aggregation Statute, because I had mentioned that the League of Cities and Towns in Rhode Island has been aggregating and doing municipal aggregation at the municipal level for municipality electricity load. So we had to work to make changes to that law because the process was just too onerous for any city or town to actually attempt to pursue aggregation. So all those hurdles are removed, but for example, one of the hurdles that a city or town one of the hurdles that would discourage a city or town from pursuing aggregation was that a city or town would have to put together an opt-in program. So when we think about anything that's opt-in and the amount of effort and time that goes into having people opt into something versus doing an opt-out. So what we have now, and a key change in the law, is that it is an opt-out program. And Daria, if you want to go back to that slide that talks about, that shows a typical aggregation program, I think that would help us with that point. Great, thank you. So this was a key critical change. So we had to ensure to make changes, and we worked with Deborah Roduro in Jamestown, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that it was an opt-out program. So once there is a plan in place and the city or town has approved that plan and it's gone through that final review process, there is an extensive educational period that continues very aggressively in letting consumers know that now they have this option. And if they choose, they can go ahead and opt out of the program. And for any consumers that are with competitive suppliers, that's the only distinction. They will have to actually opt in. And what's really encouraging that we're seeing in Massachusetts, that most people choose to stay within that program that their city or town has vetted for them, and actually don't end up opting out, which is great. All right, let's see. I want to work through a few other questions here. Another great question from Andrew: why only ask to start at 5%? Seems that we should be asking for more, especially because we need to be as aggressive as possible, as I said. So fantastic question. Yes, when facing possible catastrophic impacts of climate change, we need to be as aggressive as we can. Really, the goal is to get to net zero by 2050. So one thing to point out that I mentioned earlier here is that starting at 5% is, sort of a recommended baseline and where we kick things off in Massachusetts. And this is really for, the community being able to feel like, yes, we can achieve cost savings and we can also add an additional 5%, which at scale is still pretty significant, and it's above what the renewable energy standard or the law requires in Rhode Island. But what we're seeing that's really encouraging is some communities are choosing to start higher. And that is because there's also that level of advocacy and education happening within that community. And it's community driven. Communities are saying we can do more. And Daria pointed out that example of Brookline. So that's also going to be really key here in Rhode Island, really being able to weigh in throughout that public hearing engagement process and saying, we can do more than 5%. But this is a percentage that's going to be driven by each community, and it's going to differ. What are the issues with the law? We covered that one. Can the sources of electricity be based in Rhode Island, John asked? That is a great question. Yes, they can be. And Daria, if you want to go back to our local map of resources. So our local map of resources. So this is why we do what we do. We really want to be able to drive the demand for local renewable energy. And that's where that additionality component is critical. As a nonprofit, our staff and board, and in alignment with our mission, we've chosen to primarily focus on projects that are within Rhode Island and Massachusetts, but we do support projects across the New England states, and that's because we're tied to the same power grid in New England. So yes, we do have projects in Rhode Island that are part of the current mix, and the goal is to increase the amount of local renewable energy that's also here in Rhode Island. And a community can get, as specific as they want in terms of their goals that will, inform and drive their plan. So thank you for that great question. All right, so we cover the higher percentage. So this question, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Daria to answer this question. Why did Somerville save so much? What is based on a bad deal they had before the GMA? Was it based on a bad deal that they had before the GMA? So Daria, if you want to speak to the cost savings of Somerville?
Yes, happy to do so. So the savings that I'm assuming we're talking about this slide. So the savings here are based on a kilowatt hour, right? So we're comparing the rate of that aggregation is able to accomplish versus the rate that the utility is providing on that day, and then the next day, and then the next day, and then for every day that that this time frame covers, right? So because we're talking about kilowatt hours, it depends on the size of the community. Somerville is a bigger community than Brookline, and they also have a smaller percentage of renewables. So, and I don't offhand remember the rates, but I would guess that Brookline was a little bit higher because we had a higher percentage of renewables added. But that is not necessarily the case because the rate of your aggregation also depends at the time when you're going out to bid. And that's also a key role of the broker, is to make sure that they take your community out to bid at a time when it's favorable. So that's what Good Energy would do. They do a lot of energy research and they check to make sure that the communities are going out at the right time. So, but the key here is that these savings are per kilowatt hour. So if I use 1 kilowatt hour today, which obviously is not the case, I use way more, but Priscilla uses 2 kilowatt hours today, her savings is going to be higher because she used a higher quantity of the same thing. And we're comparing both of our rate to the utility rate. Now, there's also times in the 6-month period, 1 or 2 6-month periods, depending on what time you're covering, that these communities had we're not gaining savings, but you could see in Brookline here, let me show you, there is 1 6-month period where the utility rate is a little bit lower than the aggregation rate, but this savings is cumulative on that time frame. And so over the length of the contract, you can see Brookline saving quite a bit. I hope that answers your question. And if not, please type another question in and we will follow up.
Thank you, Darian. There was another question related to savings in Massachusetts as well. How did Somerset save $5 million at 5% when Brookline was using 25% and saved $2 million? If you want to go back to that.
Yeah, I answered that question at the same. Yeah, I answered that question together. So it's, the amount of savings you get really depends on the kilowatt hours you're using. And so all the communities do not have the exact same rate of their electricity, nor will they have the same consumption because you have different households, you have different, some communities will have industry and office buildings versus others will have more residential. So really depends on your kilowatt hour consumption.
Great, thank you, Daria. So we have a few more minutes, so I'll work through the last few questions here on the chat. So we had a question, does GMA help to go towards a possible RPS in a state? So I mentioned earlier that what communities are doing in developing a program and choosing that additional percentage of renewable energy is above what the renewable energy or portfolio standard requires in a given state, whether in Rhode Island or Massachusetts. So we want more GMA so we can continue pushing for more additional renewable energy above that state requirement. And let's see here. There was a great question about the source related to that Rhode Island report on competitive suppliers. So, John, we will follow up within the outreach materials, the presentation and the recording that we'll share. And I will go ahead and work to find that report. We have reached out to the Division of Public Utilities Commission asking for that report, but all we have seen yet is data that has been released and shared by the media. So I will share with you what we have on that and share with everyone. I think that's good to reference.
And I think we're coming up at the end. I think we're coming up at the end of our time. So should I go over some logistics of wrapping up?
Before we get to that, just one last question that I will answer for the benefit of the group, and then others we will go ahead and include in the follow-up information that Daria will share, including the logistical aspects. So there was a question about renewable energy siting and, siting solar smartly, so we're not impacting a local forest. So just wanted to point out, Green Energy Consumers Alliance has been working with our allies, including the Environment Council of Rhode Island as a whole. I'm actually the president of the Environment Council of Rhode Island, and working with allies like the Nature Conservancy, Save the Bay, Clean Water Action, Conservation Law Foundation, Audubon Society of Rhode Island, and really advocating for laws and guidance that are going to help us achieve this smart siting of solar. So as an organization, we have committed when we're looking at our local sources and really ensuring that we're supporting solar that's smartly sited. And two of our recent projects in Johnston and in North Providence have been sited on landfill. So we're going to continue doing what we do and working with our allies at the advocacy level to really ensure that, we can reach some victory when it comes to siting at the state level, and also doing what we do at the program on the program side as Green Energy Consumers. So Daria, go ahead, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Priscilla. So we will wrap up now. We have a recording of this webinar that we've made that we'll share with you. We also have the slides. I know there's some questions that did not have a chance to answer, but we have all your questions written down and we will answer them individually. And if there's anything that needs to be answered as a group, we'll send that up in a follow-up email if there's some common themes. Thank you so much for all of your time today. I appreciate taking the hour during lunchtime, especially to join us and learn about green municipal aggregation or community choice aggregation in Rhode Island. And we will be following up shortly, within a couple of days, with a recording and answers to your questions. I've posted our emails. If you have any questions, you want to reach out to us directly, please don't hesitate. And look forward to seeing you on another Green Energy Consumers Alliance webinar. Thanks for your time.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye all.